Hi, welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm your host, Casey Scott. My guest today is Roget Lockard, a highly regarded addictions counselor in Western Massachusetts. And this is the 21st and final installment of our discussions on the nature of addiction. Roget, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Casey.
Great to have you back. This has been a great pleasure for me, and informative, enlightening, and most enjoyable. So,
very much so for me. I really appreciated the opportunity to explore these ideas with you, Casey.
So let's start where we left off. In our last conversation, we were talking about addiction and sobriety at a systemic level, in all levels of systems or groups, organizations, institutions, nation states. I have a couple of documents here of your authorship that I want to refer to. And the first one is called Sobering America. And it begins, President Bush's assertion in his State of the Union address for 2006 that America is addicted to oil was for many about as startling as the notion that the sun rises in the east. And then you go on to say that this was, in fact, a very important pronouncement that the president made. And I've always believed and continue to believe that he thought he was speaking metaphorically, but turns out not to be the case.
Well, I think you're right. I think he intended to be speaking metaphorically and was speaking a truth that was far beyond the scope of his imagination or of his inclination. That had he suspected he was pointing in the direction that he would have hastened elsewhere. But it was an introduction into the national discourse of that label, of that language, that from my perspective is at the core of the various systemic crises that we're encountering today as a nation, and indeed as a species.
Of course, he observed that the big problem with that was that the oil that we need is elsewhere.
Right. In that article that you were reading from, I observed that, as you know, that it was a little bit like an alcoholic saying that my main problem is that the liquor store is in a bad neighborhood.
Yeah. I bring this up because it's kind of as you say, it's emblematic of the predicament that we're in. And we had a conversation about the price of gasoline in our last session, so I don't want to go too deeply into that. Which
has since plummeted yet more.
I'm sorry?
Which has since plummeted yet
yes,
more.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. As we tape, it's around $2.50. So, in any case, there's another document here called America's Fireworks, and I want to read just a little bit from that.
Sure.
You begin with a quote from Bill Bryson. I can't imagine that there has ever been a more gratifying time or place to be alive than America in the 1950s. The country had never known such prosperity. When the war ended, the United States had $26 billion worth of factories and that hadn't existed before the war, $140 billion in savings and war bonds, just waiting to be spent, no bomb damage, and practically no competition. All that American companies had to do was stop making tanks and battleships and start making Buicks and Frigidaires, and boy, they did. And then you go right from there to this. 8:15 a.m., August 6, 1945, a light rivaling that of the sun, indeed born of the same atom-wrenching process which fueled the sun, illuminated Hiroshima, Japan for a fraction of a second. The city and its people were transformed in an instant into a landscape from hell. And then a paragraph describing subsequent events, the bombing of Nagasaki. And then you say, Americans, not without reason, felt that they had a share in this tremendous victory. And in the article, you talk about that as as a sort of, I don't want to say turning point, but a benchmark in the development of American consciousness and everything that's happened since then.
Very much so. The way I think of it is, and I mention it also in the first paper that I wrote on the subject back in the mid-'80s, Self-Will Run Riot, The Earth is an Alcoholic. Excuse me. And I identify America's victory in the Second World War, although I don't single out the nuclear attacks in that paper, but identify that as the time when the addictive momentum in our national characterological makeup coalesced definitively around the model of addictive consciousness. It was already there. Western thinking has been inclined in that direction as we've discovered more and more technological ways of seemingly solving the problem of self. But there was such a convergence of very gratifying solutions to the question, not just, who am I, America, that it was unthinkable for practically anybody to question that what we need, just like the alcoholic who has their first drink that does magic. It's like, what I need is more of this.
So there was that sense of power and agency. We talked about agency. And
well, every one of the, if I may, that little cluster of factors that I offer as one way of thinking about what are the answers that an addictive technology provides. There's the feeling states of power, freedom, connectedness, and safety. And then out of our grappling with those achieving fulfillment in those areas, we begin to evolve a sense of meaning. And all of this then tends to give birth, if you will, on an ongoing way to an experience of identity. And that's kind of the ultimate outcome, excuse me, of addressing the problem of self experientially.
And that sort of permeates all aspects of our society, I think.
It does that. And just for a moment to go back to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think a lot of what happened there was the succinctness, if you will, of that dreadful gesture. There were, in fact, other bombing incidents in that war that were caused much more destruction, caused much more loss of life, the firebombing of Dresden and many other places. But the idea that one plane could drive over the city and drop a bomb and then run like hell, by the way. The plane itself barely made the return trip because of the tumult of the explosion. But just that idea, wow, one bomb, and that's it for that city.
Unlike Dresden, where they dropped hundreds of bombs all night.
Yeah, exactly. It was a prolonged time. It was very powerful. It was very addictive, but it didn't. It was kind of like somebody who's used to beer, and then they have their first hit of cocaine or heroin or whatever does the magic for them. It's like, oh, okay, and so that whole thing led us into a state that was very profoundly addicted and very naively addicted. It was a very earnest state of affairs. We believed in ourselves with a naivete that, looking back on it, is almost a tad embarrassing, but it came out of wrenching experience.
Yeah, many people long for that time now.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And there was, I think, a fair amount of that sentimentality in the idealization of the greatest generation and I say that without taking any of the credit away from people who sacrificed greatly, but it became awfully easy to whitewash everything, and I think a lot of men of that generation squandered parts of their life getting together, often drinking and reminiscing, or taking pride in the fact that they weren't reminiscing. I mean, that was one of the features of that generation, is we don't talk about it. And we've learned that that's more unfortunate than not, of course.
Yes, and I know men of that generation who just bottled it up, and it ultimately destroyed them.
Yeah, well, a thing of well-intended pride, if you will. Plus, the experience of vulnerability, there wasn't much room in the sociological mores of the day for men to be vulnerable.
The whole thing about war being addictive is fascinating, and it's really become. I mean, you make the observation that it's often observed that World War II was the last war we have fought that was actually declared by Congress, and it's become so much a part of our culture that now we have this endless war going on.
No end in sight.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Well, I think I've made mention before of the marvelous book with the perhaps even more marvelous title, written by Christopher Hedges, called the lengthy title, but very right on. War is a force that gives us meaning. Excuse me. And meaning is so much at the heart of existential adequacy, if you will. We really despise the experience of being meaningless. And in the meantime, as we've touched on before, we are living in a world that perfectly fits Paul Goodman's description of the 50s, which, of course, followed on the heels of the Second World War. And his book was titled Growing Up Absurd. I believe I've mentioned that here before. And the absurdity has become extravagant. It's become surreal. And so war has become an almost indispensable solution. If we're not going to have that answer to who we are, both on the individual level and on the national identity level, well, what do we have? Because if we hold still and look very long at other aspects of our selfhood as a nation, things look very sketchy, very problematic. The economy, I'm not going to try to talk about it analytically, but except to say that it's unsustainable, and environmental considerations are growing more and more acute and unsustainable, and so forth. So the immediacy of the conflict of war is kind of a relief in an awful way.
Yeah, I don't want to linger too long on that, but one might have thought that 9/11, 2001, would have been a point at which we could reach bottom.
We talked about that, I think, in an earlier show. I feel almost in grief that we passed on that opportunity. I remember fairly vividly, I believe it was 2 days after the event, and there was momentary pause, if you will, and part of what happened during that pause was the United States got a huge outpouring of sympathy from all around the world, including some of the Arab countries.
Yes.
And then Bush came to the place where he has to, the attribution of meaning. War is a force that gives us meaning. All right, how do we attach meaning to this event? And it turned out that the motive for this was that these people who committed suicide on behalf of their conviction hated our freedoms. And
there's that word again, freedom.
Freedom, yeah. But you know, he could almost have said they hated the fact that some of us wore plaid. Of course, which makes no sense at all.
Right. Yeah.
It didn't really need to make sense in any way that would stand up to deep analysis. It needed to be catchy, and it needed to dispose of the vast question, why the hell did they do this?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, they gave their lives for this.
Right.
What was going on?
That is so typical of the addict. When confronted with the evidence of the addiction, confronted with the consequences of the addiction, oh, well, we'll just push that aside.
There needs to be another way to explain it, to set it aside.
Yeah. I'd like to move on from there to talk a little bit about the environmental crisis, because it's part of that whole same complex of our reliance on all of these outside sources of agency in order to feel that we have meaning in our lives.
Well, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be outside. Some of the addictive processes are fairly private. But the key equation that we keep coming back to is the conviction that some form of control, whether it's internal or external, is going to constitute my existential solution. And looks like it.
And here we are confronted with the stark reality that we have jeopardized the health of the planet and the survival of our species, and still we don't want to deal with that.
Well, we might even say, especially, we don't want to deal with that because it's very much like the alcoholic, to pick a commonplace addiction. As their relationship with alcohol becomes more problematic, and their sense of alternatives becomes more barren, they have to simply insist that what's happening isn't happening. And it becomes, again, that word, surreal, for people around the addict, and even often enough for the addict. I remember going through my days in the later stages of my own alcoholic drinking, and part of me shaking my head, you got to be shitting me, right? It's like, what? How can you possibly be doing this? But the bottom line was there was an inner experience of necessity, uncompromising necessity. So you go along and you think as little as possible, and when you do think, you think in kind of quick, dismissive formulas, such as they hate our freedoms. That's why they drove the planes. But in terms of the environmental situation and global warming and crises consequent to global warming, it's interesting because I've become aware recently of a group of folks who are, I think most, if not all of them, already familiar with addressing addiction through the 12-step approach that we've talked about tremendously here. They make up a group called GWA, Global Warmers Anonymous, and they're in a very exploratory stage. They don't feel like we've got the answers by any means, but they do see global warming as an outcome of addictive thinking and behaviors that we have been invested in for at the least decades, and many folks would say centuries.
Yeah, well, at least since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
At least.
Yeah.
And again, I think we mentioned this, could go back as far as the introduction of, what's the word I'm looking for? Raising plants.
Oh, yeah.
Agriculture. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, agricoli.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, shall I tell you a little bit about
Yes,
this
please.
group and their experience?
Because I'm curious as to how you apply the 12 steps of recovery to global warming.
Right. And the answer to that depends on a perspective that is almost counterintuitive, because we keep thinking global warming, okay, well, the problem is out there. These people out there need to be doing things differently, starting with the politicians. Damn politicians need to blah, blah, blah. And the rich people need to blah, blah, and so forth and so on. And I'm recycling and so forth.
And I don't really need to worry so much about that beyond that, because technology is going to solve the problem anyway.
Well, that's jumping ahead a little bit,
Yeah,
but absolutely. What GWA, as I understand it, what they're up to is they are saying that the central healing that they want to invest in is the parts of themselves that are willfully investing in the conduct of their lives, including, in many cases, trying to address the problem of global warming. And you made a mention just a little bit back there of technological solutions to global warming. And of course, the key thing here is not, are there technological things that can help with global warming? Of course there are. The key thing is, what is your, well, I'm going to put it figuratively, what do you worship? And where do you see the core problem? If you see the core problem as a technological problem, then you're going to concentrate on technological solutions. If you see the core problem as a state of willfulness that informs humans on every level, from poor people who are, I'm just going to make some people angry, but very poor people who are burning down the rainforest so they can get 1 or 2 years of crop-worthy yields before that land is no good, to the multi-billionaires who are paying the companies to come in and burn down the forest so they can raise their monoculture.
Right.
So we have willfulness wherever we turn, and it always seems like a good idea until it goes bankrupt and then doesn't seem like a good idea. But as you suggested, what our mind knows to do is, okay, an alternative technology, an alternative control modality. And once again, maybe that's part of the solution, but we're going to continue with that escalating spiral, which now has taken us, unless we begin to see, okay, the core problem here is my commitment to willful way of living.
Yeah, and it really is. It's a spiritual problem. It's an existential problem. It's not a technological problem at its core.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It will continue to flourish, to use a ironic word, as long as humans are principally informed by willfulness.
And so the main thrust of this organization is not to solve the problem so much as to transform the individual members. Is that?
Well, it's an interesting, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's an interesting kind of a quandary. My understanding is that, and again I should say, that this fellowship, like all the 12-step fellowships, is made up of individuals, and if you ask 10 of them their thoughts about that question, you probably get 10 different answers, but I think a theme of commonality is, to the extent that I am tangled up in my addictive consciousness, all of the affairs and enterprises of my life ultimately suffer. Including anything I may be doing on behalf of social improvement, environmental remedies, so forth and so on. So I think they tend to see the two as going hand in hand, but there's a trickiness, because you can't get better in order to get the world better. It's like the people in Al-Anon who realize, well, if I heal, if I learn to be less all about control and so forth, then I will be more helpful, more effective, or in a less provocative figure in my spouse's addiction. But if I'm trying to get better in order to get them better, then I've tangled myself back up in the control.
It is, as they say, an inside job.
Yeah. And it's an inside job that needs to earnestly be focused inside, not strategically be focused inside.
Right. So everything that we've learned through these now 21 conversations can be applied, basically we're saying, to every aspect of our lives. And global warming is no different. So we are running out of time, Roget. So I need to ask you the standard interviewer question, and that is, what's next for Roget Lockard?
Well, as you've mentioned from time to time, I've had a book that I've been trying to give birth to for quite some time now, and it hasn't squalled yet. So in the interim, I realize, generated quite a bit of writings in one setting or another, and I'm creating a compilation of those, kind of organized around the nexus of a article in the New York Times that came out last summer that I had some problems with. So I plan to make this available once it's brought together, and if people want to get in touch with me.
I am looking forward to it. Because this is an important message. I want to just close here with this paragraph that I'd like for you to read very quickly.
This is by the primatologist Alison Jolly, and it's from the end of her book, Lucy's Legacy. It remains to be seen what role our evolved conscious purpose will play in using our new global power. We may choose despotism, ecological blight, death for other species, destruction for our own. Or we may successfully improve our lot, stabilize our demands, preserve and enrich the biosphere. Biology has nothing to predict about which course we take. It only says that we are something new under the sun. We are bringing changes to the biosphere as important as the first true cell that survived to leave progeny to inhabit the earth. Almost as drastic as the first green mote that made energy from sunlight. Just perhaps we may become even more important, not as individuals, but as a global organism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roget.
Thank you, Casey.
And it's been a great pleasure.
It's been a delight and a privilege.
And thank you for joining us. This is the last scheduled program for Come to Think of It. We may be back from time to time with a special edition, and I hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.